The launch of Lord of the Rings of Power has been interesting to say the least. On the one hand, Amazon reported after the release that 25 million people had turned in for the premiere, making it the most popular show in company history. But the mass viewership was not accompanied by mass praise. In the first few days, Amazon suspended viewers' ability to rate the show in an effort to quote weed out trolls. The audience score on RT is underwater, and even the critical response has been lukewarm at best. The negative feedback was not wholly unexpected. The July trailer for Rings of Power was crushed with over 200,000 dislikes, a staggering number, and the promotional material following that trailer did little to push the looming storm in a different direction. It's easy to get lost in the political woods with Rings of Power. There's a battle between fans who are upset that Amazon veered off Tolkien's established canon to include a black elf, and journalists who believe holding such an opinion makes you a racist. There is a conversation to be had about how flexible Amazon should be with Tolkien's world and for what reasons improvisation is justifiable. Unfortunately, any attempt at such a discussion would quickly descend into this. That is just the world we live in now. But let's say that the political disagreements were off the table. Let's imagine that Amazon decided to follow Tolkien's lore as strictly as possible, and all that's left to debate is the quality of the writing and filmmaking. Even if this was the reality, Rings of Power was destined for mediocrity. Not because of a lack of resources or passion, but because the current creative environment in Hollywood is not suited for the nature of Tolkien's world. The two most popular television shows of the past 5 years are Game of Thrones and Euphoria. And the two shows are opposite in a sense. Game of Thrones is a political drama set in a medieval world, Euphoria is a high school drama set in our own world. But despite that wide difference, they share character profiles that are essential to what makes them compelling. Game of Thrones and Euphoria don't feature traditional heroes. In Euphoria, the main character Rue is a drug addict who can be compassionate one minute and destructive the next, and one of the show's most moral supporting characters is her drug dealer. Game of Thrones became a massive cultural force by using the same dynamic. Characters are judged more for the effectiveness of their decisions, not the morality. Ned Stark was a decent man but politically naive. Tywin Lannister, brutal but savvy. And Game of Thrones also features characters like the Hound, a man who calls killing the sweetest thing there is, but he maintains empathy for the Stark girls. Both shows are well suited for Hollywood's current environment because the institution is generally in agreement with the moral relativism and materialism between the lines. Religion and spirituality are discussed in Euphoria and early Game of Thrones, but tonally and symbolically they are completely absent, and for good reason. When the showrunners of Game of Thrones were forced to resolve the Night King, an archetypal evil figure like Sauron, they had no idea what to do with him. It was like watching an English professor try to fix a car. So in the end, they just decided to kill him off like a chump mid-season. It was a predictably awful conclusion. If you dropped Game of Thrones in 1950s Hollywood, it would have been a disaster. There was the Hays Code for one, but on a deeper level, the creative culture was not made for that type of cynical story. My guess is that the artists of the time would have tried to adapt it to be a more black and white story of good and evil because it was more reflective of how they saw the world, especially after World War II. And that would have been to the show's detriment, of course. The Rings of Power finds itself in the opposite situation. Tolkien's story, as he has said, is an outgrowth of his Christian faith. It's not an allegory would actually be easier to translate to the screen. Tolkien's faith is the animating force behind his story. It's not shoved in the reader's face, there is no organized religion in Middle-earth, but the tone of the story is biblical. The characters are flawed, but they're capable of rising above their inner temptations to complete an objectively good mission. Amazon doesn't need artists who share Tolkien's faith, Peter Jackson didn't, but to get the best out of Middle-earth, it must have a baseline understanding and appreciation of the spirit behind it. That appreciation certainly existed for the writers behind the film trilogy. This is what Francis Walsh, one of the trilogy's three writers, said about Tolkien's faith in an interview. Certainly, Tolkien's faith informs the third book especially. The values in them, they give you a sense of hope that isn't chaos, that isn't arbitrary, that isn't without a point. I love storytelling for those reasons. So many things fall away as we kind of charge forward into this new century. There's so much cynicism and such a lack of ritual and a belief system to govern anything. I like stories for that because they still offer it. I don't think the minds behind Rings of Power have a similar appreciation, which again isn't surprising given the presiding culture of Hollywood. They have made creative decisions more suited for Westeros than Middle-earth, and the result is a show with an identity crisis. The most harmful example is their handling of Galadriel and her people, the Noldor. I don't have anything against female warriors. Arya Stark was a cool character, so was Brienne. Having said that, the writers of Rings of Power made a misguided trade when they turned Galadriel into one. When we meet the few Noldor left on Middle-earth and Fellowship, they are ethereal beings who almost feel above the Fellowship's mission. Galadriel herself frightens our heroes because she can sense their faults and makes them feel like they have a responsibility to be much more than they are. Her glare alone is enough to crumble even the strongest men. This power and wisdom is born from 8,000 years of life experience. But in Rings of Power, the Noldor are essentially humans with pointy ears and a bachelor's in philosophy. Galadriel is just Turiel from the Hobbit movies, more of a military leader than moral leader. These decisions fall in line with Hollywood trends, but reduce the transcendent force behind Tolkien's story. It's important to remember that The Lord of the Rings is a love story in many ways, platonic and romantic. The books and the film trilogy are great because we follow a group of characters who care a lot for each other and are willing to sacrifice their lives to allow their companions to live on. Frodo and Sam's friendship anchors the entire journey. These relationships are noticeably absent in the Amazon series. Instead, we get characters constantly at odds with each other because their interests don't align, and it makes the episodes feel remarkably soulless. In episode 4, we get a couple touching scenes between Elrond and Durin. That type of friendship is what the show needs, not political lobbying between Galadriel and the leaders of Numenor. The identity crisis doesn't only extend to the characters in the writing, but to the filmmaking as well. A number of orc scenes are shot like horror films with surprisingly gruesome violence, and soon after, the audience will get Galadriel riding a horse in slow motion with an angelic score behind her. There is not a unified vision for how the show should look or how the score should influence the tone. It's almost like they wanted to smuggle in a grittier fantasy drama, but were handcuffed by the legacy of Peter Jackson's trilogy. And the mix we get is very bizarre at times. In fact, they actually steal dialogue from Apocalypse Now in episode 4, from the scene where Willard meets Kurtz and Kurtz asks him about the Ohio River. I love Apocalypse Now, but if you're producing a Tolkien story, that's not the first movie you look to for influence. But they did, and again, it's really, really strange. The media talks a lot about the showdown between Rings of Power and House of the Dragon. If you were taking bets on the outcome before the pilots were released, I think Rings of Power would be the favorite given its massive budget and the way Game of Thrones ended. But House of the Dragon has the cultural winds at its sail. The HBO showrunners are not afraid to embrace what makes the Westeros story extremely interesting: morally great characters engaging in violence, sex, and political maneuvering. The minds behind Rings of Power, on the other hand, don't know which parts of Tolkien's story to embrace and which ones to tinker with. It's clear that they wanted to capitalize on what worked for Game of Thrones, a tone more comfortable for modern Hollywood, and blend it with the Middle-earth story, which is on the opposite end of the thematic spectrum. Under this arrangement, House of the Dragon will continue to win out with audiences. Some stories require a particular climate to thrive, and for most of Hollywood history, I don't think a live-action Tolkien adaptation would be an issue from an identity point of view, because there is an appreciation for the creation and the worldview behind it. But I think those times have passed. The best Hollywood can probably do at this point is tolerate, which will lead to mediocrity, not brilliance. The problem is worsened by the fact that Amazon is adapting the Second Age, which is relatively light in detail, so they can't even lean on Tolkien imagined plot lines to find the magic. They must invent their own. That is a recipe for pacing issues. I hope I'm proven wrong by Rings of Power. I hope Amazon can make a show that Tolkien fans and new audience members can look forward to every week, because modern entertainment is becoming more cynical every year, and Tolkien's world should be an emotionally engaging break from that. But Rings of Power doesn't serve that role right now, and I'm afraid it never will. If you have any thoughts on Rings of Power, feel free to leave them in the comments. Maybe the show is connecting with you, and if that's the case, explain which characters are responsible. But thank you so much for stopping by, I greatly appreciate it. Make sure to like and subscribe on your way out for more content, and have a fantastic rest of your day. I will talk to you soon.